we back on? So I got something to read before we start.
All right.
Good afternoon. No.
It's like, oh man, you're going to take more than a 3-minute break.
I wasn't going to read that all over again, but I wanted to see if anybody was paying attention to the chair.
It does feel like it's afternoon, though.
Yes, it's pretty darn close. This bill will clearly take us there.
Wow.
But welcome, Senator Geist. You may open on LB 167.
All right, thank you, Chairman Lathrop, and good morning. It is barely still morning, but good morning, Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Suzanne Geist, S-U-Z-A-N-N-E-G-E-I-S-T. I represent the 25th District, which is the east side of Lincoln and Lancaster County. I am passing around an amendment that actually replaces the bill. There are some tweaks in the amendment from the bill, and then it did eliminate a couple of paragraphs near the end of the bill. So I'm referring to the bill but in my testimony, but if you would just in your mind know I'm referring to the amendment. I'm not going section by section, so I think it will be clear. I have introduced LB 167 because as I watched what was going on around the country through the declared state of emergency in 2020, I became concerned, and specifically when I saw what was happening in Las Vegas, where casinos are allowed to reopen, when thousands of people streaming in at a 50% capacity, while at the same time in Nevada, churches were prohibited from holding worship services of more than 50 people. If they held larger services, they faced criminal and civil penalties. My concern grew as I watched religious organizations in other states have to fight to provide much-needed services and hope to their members. This fight was taken all the way to the Supreme Court with the South Bay Pentecostal Church versus Gavin Newsom, Governor of California, case. This case was brought to ensure that religious organizations did not have more harsh restrictions imposed on them by the government compared to secular businesses. LB 167 would codify this recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling to ensure that Nebraska religious organizations are protected from discrimination during a public crisis, national disaster, or state of emergency. Putting these protections in statute is necessary to ensure problems do not arise in the future. I'll add that we're fortunate in the state of Nebraska that this was not an issue in our state, and I'm bringing this bill to make sure in the future it doesn't become one. Religious organizations provide services that are vital to health and welfare of our state. Not only do they meet the spiritual needs of our people, but they also support social services such as feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, providing mental health and health care services. Churches and their ministries are desperately needed to provide these services to those in need, and especially important during a time of crisis, such as a pandemic, a natural disaster, or state of emergency. In my bill, public health officials have the authority to protect health and public safety, but the First Amendment, including the free exercise of religion, is never suspended. I made sure that this bill does not limit, and you'll want to notice this, it doesn't limit or change government's ability to protect public health and safety. It permits the government to implement neutral health, safety, and occupancy requirements on all businesses and services, and simply prohibits any government official from singling out religious organizations for harsher restrictions. This bill would ensure that religious organizations of all faiths in Nebraska do not have to fight all the way to the Supreme Court to ensure that their rights are protected by future legislators. Not only will it ensure that government officials in Nebraska can protect public health and safety without violating the First Amendment, but will also ensure that Nebraska provides religious organizations with the same rights and freedoms as secular businesses during a pandemic, a natural disaster, or state of emergency. Thanks for your time and attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Senator DeBoer.
Hi, thank you, Senator Geist, for bringing this bill. The one question I have is this not already the law?
It is in the sense of this is part of the First Amendment. What changes, and what this actually would codify in Nebraska is the ability, and I believe it's section 2 with subsections 1 and 2 is the most important part that allows no, actually, that reference is incorrect. It's later in the amendment that allows the church or organization to go to the government and prove their case. They can say this is whatever the requirement that they see has been put upon them by the government. They can say because this is posed an undue burden to our congregation, which is specified in my amendment, they can go to the court and get relief for that.
And so the enforcement mechanism is to go to the court?
Yes.
Okay. Which you already have to do, but we can talk about this later.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Brain.
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop. Thank you, Senator Geist, for bringing this bill. This is really sort of an interesting bill. So a religious organization goes and asks for the exemption or the right to do something in the face of a disaster, whether that disaster is COVID or flood or tornado or whatever. Is the state held harmless? By that I mean they're doing something that they feel is correct because of their religious beliefs, but then if they are injured by the event, whatever that event are the taxpayers in the state held harmless?
What this would do, let's just say for a DHM, for instance, the only thing that this is asking is parity. That the government does not impose a harsher restriction on that religious organization than it's imposed on any other non-religious organization. However, what it also allows is if the government can show a compelling interest of having to restrict a religious organization for whatever reason, health, safety, public welfare, that's allowed in this. So does that answer your question?
I believe so.
Okay.
The only other question I guess I have is because, if we're talking about a church congregation, we are talking about a family gathering here, we're talking about a group of 100, 200, a large number of people, and if you have a public health crisis that involves having a number of people together, and by having that number of people together, it perpetrates the crisis. I'm not opposed to that, but I don't want the state held liable if they're trying to correct that.
And I want to clarify that it would have, a church organization would have to follow the same requirements as long as they're applied neutrally across the board. They're not asking for special rights in that situation, as long as it's health, safety, public safety, that sort of thing. They're asking not to be treated more harshly.
Okay, thank you. I think that explains it.
I do have a couple of questions for you, Senator Geist, and it's maybe by way of clarification, but Section 2 basically provides the government shall permit religious organizations to continue to conduct their normal operations or their normal services. And then it says, but nothing in that provision stops the government from imposing duties or limitations and applying them to churches as long as they've provided it to other, it says all other organizations and businesses.
Okay.
So under this bill is, and I'm just trying to get to your intent on this one. And we'll take this latest pandemic since that's probably the reason
the onus for the bill.
For the bill in the first place. So we've talked about essential workers and essential services. And I'll give you an example. Meatpacking workers, we regard them as essential workers. They were allowed to continue to operate in a normal fashion I'm on the Business and Labor Committee. We've heard a lot of stories, a lot of accounts, I should say, of meat packers who stood shoulder to shoulder with other meat packers during the pandemic. So that's an organization or a business.
Right.
Do we have to make everybody not run? If we say, let me put it differently, can the government, under your bill, carve out certain businesses and say they deserve special treatment, but we're not going to apply that special treatment to the church?
They can
Because it seems to me, let me maybe just pontificate for a second. It seems to me that you have, the pandemic hits, we don't know a lot about it at the front end, we know there's community spread, and they say, well, we need to stop bars and restaurants. Everybody ought to stay home unless you have a good reason for being out. But then we started to segregate who should be open and who should be closed, right? And I'm thinking of meatpacking workers, those folks, everybody needs their protein, right? And we need to take care of the animals that need to be processed. So the meatpacking workers were there, and they may have worn masks. At some point, they might have put up some plexiglass, but nothing about their operations changed otherwise, to speak of, near as I can tell from the accounts I've heard. Can the church then say, wait a minute, the meatpacking place is down at the Tyson Platte, nothing's changed, so you don't get to make us go to 50% capacity?
Actually, that's a good question, and I think that's covered when it says the state can show a compelling reason, a compelling interest. Now, that interest is going to directly relate to the religious organization, but if the state can show in that situation that we're not prohibiting or not, we're permitting and not prohibiting your involvement here at the church, but for our compelling interest, this is what we're doing?
I'm going to throw something out here for your consideration, and that is a compelling interest is almost always going to be found when we say there's a pandemic, there's a compelling interest. I think what we're looking for is there a logical reason for the people who are accepted out from the direct health measures, right? The compelling interest, as soon as there's a pandemic, the state's going to clear that hurdle. I think what you're trying to do is, if I understand the purpose, you're trying to say there has to be a compelling reason for the distinction between the people you are allowing to continue to operate and those you stop or those you limit.
But it's also prohibiting the government from limiting beyond that, beyond a non-religious, what your typical DHMs. It's prohibiting the government from saying, but we're going to make the example in Las Vegas, where the government allowed 50% occupancy in a casino. However, only 50 people within a congregation.
So that really is, this is a consequential bill, and that's why I'm asking these questions.
Yes.
And I realize it's important to you. If I say, if I'm the mayor or the governor, and I say, every place has to be at 50% occupancy, but Tyson can still operate at 100%. Or Hy-Vee can still be at 100% because we all need our food. Or the hospital can still be at 100%. Some cases they're going to 110. I don't know who we're supposed to compare the churches to and who they should not be compared to when deciding whether you, the church, have a cause of action against the government for what you are imposing on the church. I get what you're driving at, because it's irritating if they're walking into the casino, but they can't walk into the church, or they're going to the tattoo parlor, but not the church. But that seems to be whether we're classifying the churches in direct health measures accurately or logically. Anyway.
And it also speaks to what my bill also does, is reaffirms the importance of the rights in the First Amendment, and I understand you're asking if the church then could turn around and ask for broader abilities because of those specific carve-outs. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it seems to me that there are some things, I don't want to say church isn't essential, right? But some things that are where people gather, restaurants, for example, the arenas to watch hockey or basketball or football or, stadiums, those kinds of things where people can gather, and places of employment. Anyway, it's an interesting bill. I'm sure we'll have an interesting
Discussion.
conversation.
I hope so.
But thank you for presenting
Sure.
it. We'll see what the proponents have to say. We'll take proponent testimony. If you're here to testify in support, you may come forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Lathrop and the Judiciary Committee. My name is Solo Mwania, SOLOMWANIA. I'm the lead pastor at Lincoln City Church here in Lincoln, and been involved with the congregation for 19 years or so. And first of all, I will piggy off my testimony with a question that the chairman was asking, Senator Geist, in regards to the distinction between the church. Maybe you use the example maybe of the Hy-Vee being an essential service. And one of the things that we've seen happen through the pandemic, and our heart goes out to all the people that are suffering, and so many people have died through this pandemic. And as a church community, the faith community, we are as involved as everybody else. And in many times, not just the physiological impact, we are down with the families and the people impacted in taking care of their emotional and spiritual needs. I've buried people, I've lost 2 friends with this pandemic. But to clarify that question, I think there's a definition or a classification of faith that has been applied with limited understanding with people who do not know faith. There are a lot of people, and I respect that, they're not religious, they're not people of faith or anything. So matters of faith, to them, they might look at it and classify faith or church as entertainment. When you compare church, football game or show at the Lead Center, they're entertainment. People of faith participate in those things as well. But for us who are people of faith, we see it as a religious. It's not an entertainment or a society or a club as you would, but it's actually a conviction where the founders recognized this when they framed the Constitution and founded the nation, and they made freedom of religion as one of those core values in the country. The reason I support what Senator Geist is proposing here, as an immigrant, I'm an immigrant from Kenya, and I've lived in Nebraska for 19 years. All my kids were born and raised in Nebraska. One of the things we always looked at America as growing up in other countries where civil individual liberties or religious liberty wasn't always respected is that America was always the one place that was the big brother, the one place you could go and say, this is really the land of the free. And I couldn't tell you the number of times I've stood before the congregation and said how grateful I am to be in a place where you could worship freely. You could choose whether you decide to be religious or not, but you can worship freely without feeling that your conscience are being infringed upon. And that's where faith is distinctive. We have continued throughout the pandemic, God forbid, after COVID-19, history teaches us that there will be other pandemics. I'm sorry, I'm got it a little winded. May I, with your permission,
Finish your
continue?
thought, sure.
I'll finish my thought. As the pandemic continues, we don't stop what our calling is, helping families. And one of the dramatic things that has happened during the pandemic is that more and more people are suffering with mental health issues, depression's gone up, substance abuse, domestic abuse, and communities are faced, if our faith, our ability to practice our faith in the way that is defined with our conscience and our calling, we've continued to work with families as they navigate through the hardships that we are all experiencing due to this pandemic, even more critical in this time. And so what I see Senator Geis is doing here is to protect us from things like what's happened in Las Vegas. And I know ministers in fellowship that have actually had to deal with that in Nevada. And so that in Nebraska, we could at least feel that our legislatures are protecting us from having to do our work without fear that the government will infringe upon. We're not in competition with the government. We are working cohesively in helping the society.
Okay. Pastor, thanks for your testimony.
I appreciate your time.
I do not see any questions at this time. I really do appreciate you coming down. I know you patiently waited to testify today too. We appreciate that as well. Oh, hang on a minute. We have Senator Pansy Brooks, I think. So here's a question from Senator Pansy Brooks. Don't the city and state governments know what is best regarding a pandemic due to information from health experts and have special duties to keep citizens safe? How can we exempt churches or other groups who can still meet remotely when we are charged with protection of our citizens' life, liberty, and happiness?
I appreciate that. That's a very good question. What we are asking for is not an exemption that supersedes anything. I think the concern that we are having right now is when people who are not people of faith maybe are antagonistic or don't see any value in the lives of the people of faith, is that when they start treating people of faith differently than they would otherwise treat others. And that's what we are asking for. It hasn't happened, thankfully, in the state of Nebraska yet, but you see the trend in other states and you think, okay, what can we do preemptively to ensure that those types of infringements on practicing faith don't occur in the state of Nebraska?
Okay. Senator DeBoer.
Thank you. That raised a question for me. I think then what I'm hearing you say is that there's a concern that, here, let me do that. There's a concern that when people are making decisions about directed health measures and they're having to weigh things, because that's what has to happen, that you're saying that if they don't properly value faith, they may not weigh things properly when they're determining the cost-benefit analysis.
That is very clear, Senator, because many people who, if you don't have faith, there are certain convictions. It's not a conviction. If you're not a faith person, it's not a conviction. And so people classify faith in those terms as maybe the gatherings, they classify it as maybe with the same measure like an entertainment event would be. And the argument is the faith is different, and the thing that seems to be sometimes misunderstood about the people of faith is that we are not in contention or in competition. Actually, we are working with we're working with people to help nurture through the whole person, the spiritual, the emotional, and all that. So that the faith community at large is not trying to, our goals are the same. Like, we're not going to put people that we care for. It's the people of faith that walk through people's lives in some of the hardest times of their lives. People of faith are usually there to comfort and to strengthen. So we are not going to be willfully put people in jeopardy that we care for and that we walk with from birth to death.
So I think Senator Pansy Brooks' question then might be, knowing that you're not I think everybody recognizes that you're not going to willfully put someone in danger. I think her question is it possible that just as the folks who are making the decisions maybe don't value faith enough, or you have a concern that they don't value faith enough to properly weigh things, is it possible that faith leaders may not have enough information to properly weigh things?
I think the public information is accessible to the people of faith in the same way that it is accessible to secular people.
Sure, I'm saying, but the decision makers, right? Because we've seen that as this pandemic is unfolding, the decision makers sort of learn first, and then they try to get information out, but maybe it doesn't all get out, and it certainly doesn't get out in the same speed to everyone that it gets out to the decision makers. So it's an interesting question, because it's saying we have concerns that they may not, on one hand, that the leaders may not weigh things properly because of their own biases. On the other hand, there's a concern that faith leaders may not properly weigh things because they don't have all the information. So thank you, that clarified very much, thank you.
Appreciate that.
Okay. Pastor, I don't see any other questions, but thanks for being here today.
All right, thank you for your time.
Anyone else here to speak as a proponent on LB167?
Good afternoon. My name is Amber, A-M-B-E-R, last name Parker, P-A-R-K-E-R. I'm here to address that I am a proponent for LB167, and in addressing, I would like to list why. I'm a greatly concerned American seeing what is happening in the United States of America. We are seeing power being usurped over the people, going to meetings even like today, and in some other areas, our freedom of speech being shut off based upon rules. So I want to address in the capital city, the mayor in the Lincoln, Nebraska area, Mayor Baird, she had addressed a curfew and had posted as safety and concern for the people in the capital city, which we're here today. However, she sat in with protesters and things like this, and I just want to be clear that during this time, the city, the capital city and Lincoln, Nebraska, went through millions of dollars of damage. Meanwhile, law-abiding citizens sat at home. Mayor Baird, I believe, sat in with the protesters. And if anybody were to go out, they would be breaking curfew. So this is where I want to tie these 2 points together. Recently, again in the capital city, Mayor Baird is she's still under complete control and under what is known as the emergency during to the COVID-19 and everything going like that. Citizens have shown up at the meetings to approach and address with city council members, but continually are interrupted by Jane Raybould and Pat Lopez on that committee. And why I want to bring this up, it's so hypocritical, because in these meetings, if you go, you'll see citizens who have shown that there are garbage bag seats and they can't go in, but there was another meeting where they allowed them in. And the reason we need LB167 is the point that when the mayor declared the curfew in the capital city, she allowed protesters and things like that. But what about if people wanted to go to their church and protest or even pray and stand up in unity and saying, if there was ever a time, let's reach out together? But she never gave that choice. So LB167, we really do need these protective measures, because it's outlining and clarifying, as State Senator Geis had said, that the compelling evidence for health and safety in warfare, and that the state can show compelling interest was the words. I don't know if she had said evidence. but that's what's really important. So I just give you an example of what's happening with the mayor in the capital city of Lincoln, Nebraska, and that she is still under emergency rule, and due to the council, many of the council members, other than Christensen, she is not answering. They will not answer when she comes out of that level of power. So LB167 protects us from tyrannical leaders, as what Mayor Beard has done to the people and shutting their voices off and working with the city council.
Okay. I don't see any questions.
Thank you.
Next proponent. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Gwen Easter, Gweneaster, and I'm with Safe Haven Community Center, Safe Haven Early Childhood Preschool Education Academy, but I'm also a minister, and I would like to support you all to support LB167, and the reason for that is from my experience of seeing what has happened across the country with the churches, and to me there has been I would say like discrimination against some churches, and there should be some concern about what's happening. I think that people should be allowed to look at the information that's provided by the professionals, although a lot of times they too have been up and down with giving information out pertaining to the COVID, and it's kind of been, the information has just kind of been up and down is all I can say right now. But I think that people should be allowed to decide for themselves whether or not they want to attend a church service. This time has been like depressing for a lot of people. People have lost, their jobs, their family members' homes, and they need their churches open. They need to be able to, pastors need to be able to decide, if the congregation should come together. Most people want to worship, and if they're being allowed to, people are being allowed to go to other gatherings or other events like, protests and, like he said, games and all this, then the same should be applied to churches and to those people's lives, and they should have a choice, a decision to make for themselves, not having all these professionals that sometimes don't agree with each other about what is really going on with this whole COVID, making decisions about our entire families. So that's all I really wanted to say.
Okay. I don't see any questions. Thanks for being here. Any other proponents?
Excuse my limping. I had a run-in with the ice on Sunday. My name is Marilyn Asher, M-A-R-I-L-Y-N-A-S-H-E-R. And I do not have prepared testimony, but as a former religious and volunteer coordinator for the state of Nebraska, as I stated before, I don't think we can underestimate or overestimate the value of the faith community in Nebraska. We had volunteers coming from all over Nebraska to serve the inmates, and now they're not able to because of the pandemic, which is understandable. But I have just seen a lot of extra depression in people I know that have not been able to get together in church services. And as Senator Geis said, some of the stringent rules have not come through in Nebraska, but I just want to say that the value of the faith community is so important, my heart goes out to the Nebraska inmates who have not been able to receive the services of those volunteers, regardless of the religion that is represented. And I think we're going to have some work to make up when they are able to go into the Department of Corrections. But I myself am a volunteer and cannot go in. But I just want to affirm what the other testimonies have been. Thank
Okay.
you.
Senator DeVore.
I want to ask you a question that's a little off topic.
Sure.
Because of something you just said. You said that folks are not able to go do religious work in the penitentiary. Is that correct?
Right. The
And-
volunteers have been,
The volunteers have been stopped? It was my understanding, that that had stopped before. Is that true? Because of the modified operations?
at the beginning of the pandemic.
No, in October of last year, I think it was, that they had gone to the 12-hour shifts, and so that their evening activities, including their religious activities.
It has impact, yes, that has happened in the prisons in
So,
the past.
okay,
And the religious coordinators end up bearing quite a bit of the responsibility for the spiritual life of the inmates, even though, there's various religions that they are servicing. And that happens in the prisons. It just happens. But I don't believe across the board in all the prisons in Nebraska, there's been a 9-month suspension.
that happened during the pandemic.
Yes.
Because I know that they were saying, I'm just trying to find out because I wanted to know, it was something I was very concerned about before with the modified operations, that they were taking away these volunteer opportunities for faith-based volunteering. So do you have any information about that, or you don't know for sure?
Well, the reason that with the modified operations, it's just the custody load is so heavy when there's a higher level of restriction as far as supervising those services. I believe that probably the clergy were possibly able to still come in for one-on-one visits, but as far as the services, quote unquote, the group gatherings of inmates, that would have been restricted. Now, I myself am a piano teacher at the Nebraska Correctional Youth Facility, and even those activities have been stopped just because of they opened it up and from like March to June, and then it clamped down again, and I have not been able to go back in.
Okay, sorry, this is off topic, Senator Geist. I didn't mean to take us down a different path, but you were here, so thank you.
Sure.
Okay. I don't see any other questions for you. Thanks for being here, Ms. Asher. Any other proponents? Anyone here to speak in opposition to LB167? Anyone here in the neutral capacity wants to be heard in a neutral capacity? Seeing none, Senator Geist, you may close. We do have 96 position letters. 91 of them are proponents and 5 of them are opponents. And if you'll allow me to, we have written testimony as follows. Tom Vinzer with Nebraska Catholic Conference is a proponent. Meg Graz with Nebraska Family Alliance is a proponent. Spike Eichel with the ACLU of Nebraska is an opponent. John Cannon with NACO is an opponent. And Karina McCormick, PhD, not representing any organization, has provided written testimony in opposition. You may close.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sitting through part of your lunch hour. I appreciate that. One of the things I did want to comment on your question, Senator Lathrop, was there was a Supreme Court case in New York that addressed other organizations' ability to open when the synagogue in that case was not able to open at its capacity as the other organization. What they found in this case is that actually the synagogue was operating and had the ability to operate at a much safer, cleaner, healthier capacity than the organization that it was being held against. So some interesting things, we can talk about it later. And if there's something that I can do to make this more clear, I think you understand the intention of the bill, and it's very worthy, I think, of being heard and hopefully passed. So I appreciate your time, and just know I'm here to answer questions and help you out as much as I can.
Senator McKinney.
Yes.
Thank you. Senator Geis, do you think if these restrictions weren't put in place that we would have been able to control the spread of the virus like we did? It's bad, but I believe that had we not had these restrictions in place, it could have been worse.
I'm not a pandemic expert, so I don't know on my own intelligence if that's the case. I think that there's some anecdotal evidence to say that spreading a pandemic is something that's microscopic and in our vapor air is very difficult to control. I think we can do our best to manage our exposure. I don't know, to be honest, if our directed health measures have really done what they're intended to do. And I'm not speaking specific to Nebraska. I think there are other states that have been much more restrictive than we have.
Because what honestly concerns me is I've heard of multiple situations where people still want to go to church or saying we don't care about masks, God is going to protect us, and we just need to just gather. And that's what concerns me, because how do we control the spread of a virus if we have individuals in our communities just freely walking around maskless and not really caring about the virus at all?
Well, I think you're voicing something that others have voiced. It's also, and people of faith also believe. Now, I don't necessarily prescribe to that thinking, but the faith community, because of their First Amendment right, does not want the government to be the judge of how they express their faith. And that's where this is important. Because it's not the role of the government to decide. Now, I understand the role of the government in this case is for public safety, and they're not asking to be exempted from public safety, but it's also not their role to decide how the free exercise of their religion is demonstrated. And that's where it's a very difficult balancing act, but also why we think that this legislation is important.
Thank you.
I do have one more question for you.
Okay.
So, in the cause of action that you provide for Section 4, you set out the relief that someone may receive as part of the litigation that might follow a direct health measure imposed on a church. And declaratory relief and injunctive relief, I understand that. You want to enjoin the public health official from shutting down the churches. That would be the nature of the complaint. You also have C, compensatory damages for pecuniary and non-pecuniary. Okay. Pecuniary would be money losses that a religious organization would experience. So here's my question. If I am the mayor of Omaha and I say the church has got to shut down and you file suit, can you claim that if we had church like we regularly do and they pass the basket, we would have $5,000 in receipts? You won't let us have church, so our damages include the loss of revenue from passing the basket at church.
And my understanding of that is yes.
Okay. So non-pecuniary, we often, that's a strange word. That would normally be sort of general damages, sort of the pain and suffering, inconvenience, loss of enjoyment of life, is that for the church, like the pastor or the priest, or is the organization bringing that on behalf of all of its members who are unable to attend?
Okay, I'm not an attorney. My thinking is it would have to fall within the definition. I don't know. I'm not going to venture a guess. I don't want to
I
put
think it's
myself in a
important that we
corner.
have a record, though, of what you regarded for pecuniary loss, and whether that would include the money the church doesn't get by passing the basket on a Sunday they can't operate.
And that would have to be shown over time. I'm sure they'd have to look back and
We
say
have
what
ways
is
to prove the
typical.
damages. I just want to make sure that you were talking about the collections.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for Senator Geist? I see none.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you being here today with LB 167. That'll close our hearing on LB 167 and our hearings for this morning. We will be back in an hour.